January 17th, 1945. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The snow fell in soft, deliberate silence across the frozen Belgian countryside, muffling the world beneath a white shroud that should have brought peace. Instead, it concealed death. In a clearing ringed by skeletal pines, a lone M4 Sherman tank sat idling, its engine coughing diesel smoke into the frigid air. Inside, 5 American tankers breathed clouds of vapor, their hands numb despite wool-lined gloves, their faces smudged with oil and frost. Through the narrow vision slits, they could see the wreckage, 3 burned-out Shermans from their company, blackened hulls still smoking, turrets blown clean off their rings like bottle caps, flicked by a careless hand. The metallic stench of scorched metal mixed with something worse, burned rubber, fuel, flesh. They had lost 15 men in 6 minutes, and yet the crew of Lucky Legs, a tank nicknamed after a pinup girl painted on its glacis plate, prepared to advance again. The driver, a farm boy from Iowa named Jimmy Kowalski, pressed his forehead against the cold steel and whispered a prayer his grandmother had taught him in Polish. The commander, Lieutenant Robert McKay, 23 years old with a Bronze Star already pinned to his chest, scanned the tree line through his periscope, knowing full well that somewhere out there a German Panther or Tiger awaited, its 88mm gun capable of punching through his Sherman's armor like a fist through wet paper. He knew the odds. Every American tanker in Europe knew the odds. And still, they went forward. This was not ignorance. This was not bravado. This was something the German panzer crews, despite their superior armor and firepower, could never quite comprehend. A peculiar American defiance rooted not in the machinery of war, but in something far more powerful and far more dangerous to the Third Reich's ambitions. To understand why American tankers preferred their so-called death traps and still managed to outfight Germany's finest armored divisions, one must step back from the frozen Belgian forest and journey to a different kind of battlefield, the one fought in factories, supply depots, training grounds, and in the minds of men who crewed machines they knew were outmatched, yet believed in something the panzers could not kill with their superior guns. The legend and the reality. The M4 Sherman tank, by 1944, had earned a grim collection of nicknames among those who fought in and against it. The Germans called it Der Tommykoker, the Tommy Cooker, a sardonic reference to how quickly it could burst into flames when struck. American GIs, with their darker humor, sometimes called them Ronsons, after the cigarette lighter company whose advertising slogan promised "Lights first time, every time." British troops coined the brew-up special, watching American Shermans erupt in pillars of fire when hit by German anti-tank guns. These names were not affectionate. They were epitaphs. The statistics were damning. A German Tiger I tank weighing 56 tons and armed with the legendary 88mm KWK-36 gun could penetrate a Sherman's frontal armor from over a mile away. The Sherman's 75mm M3 gun, by contrast, could barely scratch a Tiger's frontal plate even at point-blank range. The kill ratio told a brutal story. American armor doctrine acknowledged that it might take 5 Shermans to destroy a single Tiger, and the crews operating those 5 tanks understood with crystalline clarity that 4 of them would likely burn before the 5th got lucky. Captured German after-action reports from Normandy documented panzer crews knocking out 7, 8, sometimes 10 Shermans in a single engagement without receiving a penetrating hit themselves. The Sherman's armor was pitifully thin by late war standards, just 51mm at the front, barely 38mm on the sides. The German Panther, which entered service in 1943, boasted 80mm of sloped frontal armor, effectively doubling its protective value. The Tiger II, or King Tiger, was even more formidable, 150mm at the front, making it virtually immune to the standard Sherman's gun. American tankers went into battle knowing they were outgunned, out-armored, and in a straight-up duel, outclassed. And yet. By May 1945, when the guns finally fell silent across Europe, American armored divisions had torn through the Wehrmacht's panzer forces, advanced from Normandy to Berlin, liberated France, crossed the Rhine, and reduced Hitler's thousand-year Reich to rubble in less than a year. German armored forces, equipped with what many historians still consider the finest tanks of the Second World War, had been systematically destroyed, not by superior American technology, but by something the German General Staff had fatally underestimated. What the Panzermen expected. When Germany's panzer crews first encountered American armor in North Africa in 1943, then later in Sicily and Italy, they approached the engagements with confidence, bordering on arrogance. This was not unearned. The German military tradition stretched back to Frederick the Great, refined through the Franco-Prussian War, perfected in the trenches of the First World War, and revolutionized in the Blitzkrieg campaigns that shattered Poland, France, and the Soviet Union's Western armies. German tank design philosophy emphasized quality over quantity, creating armored monsters that served as mobile fortresses, Panzerkampfwagen, that could dominate any battlefield through superior firepower and protection. German tankers were, by 1944, among the most experienced and best-trained armored troops in the world. Many had fought across the endless steppes of Russia, where they learned to destroy entire Soviet tank brigades in sprawling armored battles around Kursk and Karsk. They had faced the Russian T-34, which was itself superior to the Sherman in many respects, and prevailed through tactical skill and technological advantage. When intelligence reports indicated that American forces would be equipped primarily with the M4 Sherman, a medium tank that German gunners could penetrate at ranges exceeding a kilometer, the panzer crews expected easy hunting. Obergefreiter Heinrich Boll, a gunner in a Panther tank of the 2nd Panzer Division, wrote in a letter home after his first engagement with American armor in France. "The American tanks are coffins on tracks. Our 88s tear through them like they are made of tin. Their crews are brave, but bravery cannot stop an armor-piercing shell. This will be easier than Russia. At least the Russians had the T-34 and the Stalin tanks to make us nervous. The Americans bring us targets." This assessment was not unique. After-action reports from German panzer units in the summer of 1944 consistently noted the Sherman's vulnerabilities and expressed confidence that American armored forces could be contained and destroyed through superior equipment and tactical expertise. SS Obersturmführer Kurt Meyer, commanding the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, briefed his officers before the invasion. "When the Americans come, remember, their equipment is inferior, mass-produced junk from factories that prioritize numbers over quality. One German tank equals 5 American tanks. One German soldier equals 5 American soldiers. We will throw them back into the sea." What the Germans expected was a repetition of their earlier victories. Technologically superior panzers manned by veteran crews would systematically destroy American armor through long-range gunnery and tactical superiority, breaking the will of inexperienced American tank crews who would quickly realize they were outmatched. They expected American forces to behave like the French in 1940 or the British at Dunkirk, to buckle under the pressure of German armor superiority and retreat in disorder. They were catastrophically wrong. What they actually experienced. The first hints that something was different came not in the thunder of tank guns, but in silence, specifically in what the German panzers could not hear. American armor did not advance alone. It never advanced alone. For every Sherman pushing through a hedgerow in Normandy or crossing a river in Belgium, there were dozens of other systems working in concert. Artillery spotters calling down massed fire from howitzer battalions miles away, fighter bombers circling overhead, waiting for target coordinates, tank destroyer units maneuvering into ambush positions, mechanized infantry in half-tracks ready to exploit breakthroughs, engineering units preparing to bridge rivers or clear obstacles, and supply columns ensuring that ammunition, fuel, and spare parts flowed forward without interruption. German Panzer Ace Otto Carius, who would finish the war credited with destroying over 150 enemy tanks, wrote in his memoir about an engagement near Caen. "We destroyed 4 Shermans within 5 minutes. I felt confident we had broken their attack. Then the artillery came. Not one battery, dozens of batteries. Shells fell for 30 minutes without pause. We could not move, could not see, could not communicate. When the barrage lifted, 8 more Shermans appeared, flanking our position from the west, where we had no support. We destroyed 3 more, but they kept coming. And behind them, their infantry, fresh and well supplied, moved with a coordination we had not seen since Poland. This was not the easy fight we expected." The American combined arms doctrine, refined in the deserts of North Africa and perfected in Italy, transformed the Sherman from a vulnerable medium tank into a component of an overwhelming system. German tanks might win individual duels, but they never fought duels. They fought battles where American artillery plastered their positions, American air power hunted them relentlessly, American tank destroyers, armed with high-velocity guns specifically designed to kill panzers, ambushed them from concealed positions, and American Shermans, understanding their limitations, used mobility and numbers to envelope and overwhelm their opponents. Hauptmann Franz Backe, commanding a Tiger Company in Normandy, documented this reality in his report. "The American Sherman crews have learned not to engage us frontally. They use smoke, terrain, and their superior numbers to flank our positions. When we destroy one, 2 more appear from different angles. When we maneuver to counter them, their artillery, always their artillery, pins us down. When we try to withdraw, their aircraft find us. We can win every engagement and still lose the battle." This is not warfare as we have known it. This is industrial combat, and we are being ground down by a machine we cannot stop. What stunned German tank crews even more than American tactical adaptation was the sheer abundance they encountered. When a Sherman was destroyed, another appeared to replace it, sometimes within hours. When a German Panther threw a track or suffered engine failure, a problem that plagued German armor with depressing regularity, it often had to be abandoned because spare parts, recovery vehicles, or fuel were simply unavailable. American Shermans that broke down were recovered, repaired, and returned to service with ruthless efficiency. German intelligence officers examining captured American supply depots were astounded by what they found. Mountains of spare parts, barrels of fuel, cases of ammunition, replacement engines still in Cosmoline, entire tanks in reserve, and food, so much food that it seemed obscene to soldiers whose own rations had dwindled to ersatz bread and watery soup. The American advantage, logistics as weaponry. The Sherman tank was not designed to be the best tank on the battlefield. It was designed to be everywhere on the battlefield all the time, fully supplied and mechanically reliable. This philosophy reflected a uniquely American approach to industrial warfare, one that the German General Staff, despite their tactical and operational brilliance, fundamentally failed to appreciate until it was too late. The United States produced 49,334 Sherman tanks during the Second World War. By contrast, Germany manufactured approximately 6,000 Panthers and 1,347 Tigers across all variants. The arithmetic was brutal and inescapable. Even accounting for the Sherman's tactical inferiority in one-on-one engagements, the Americans could afford to lose 5 Shermans for every German heavy tank and still emerge victorious through sheer numerical superiority. But the numbers alone do not capture the full picture. What made the Sherman truly deadly was not how many were built, but how they were sustained in combat. Every Sherman was designed for mass production and ease of maintenance. Its components were standardized, interchangeable, and simple enough that crew members with minimal training could perform field repairs. The engine, a reliable if unspectacular radial aircraft engine or diesel, could be swapped out in a matter of hours by a trained maintenance crew. Tracks could be repaired with common tools. The 75mm gun used ammunition that was abundant and easily transported. The entire tank was engineered with the understanding that it would be operating thousands of miles from American factories, supplied across oceans, and would need to remain operational despite the chaos of combat. German tanks, by contrast, were masterpieces of over-engineering. The Panther's Maybach engine was powerful but temperamental, prone to catching fire, and difficult to replace in field conditions. The Tiger's interleaved road wheels, designed to distribute the tank's massive weight, were brilliant in theory but a maintenance nightmare in practice. Frozen mud could jam the wheels completely, and replacing an inner wheel required removing several outer wheels first, a process that could take a day. German tanks were designed for short, decisive campaigns where maintenance facilities and supply lines were close at hand. When the war shifted to one of attrition fought across vast distances, German armor's technological sophistication became a liability. Lieutenant Colonel Wilson M. Hawkins, who commanded a Sherman battalion through France and into Germany, explained it simply. Sure, their Tigers could kill us at 1,000 yards, but half the Tigers we faced weren't operational, broken down, out of fuel, or abandoned for lack of parts. Our Shermans just kept running. We could fight, take losses, get resupplied, repair our damaged tanks, and be back in action while the Germans were still trying to figure out how to get their fancy panzers started. The supply chain that sustained American armor in Europe was itself a weapon of war. The Red Ball Express, a truck, convoy system that at its peak operated 6,000 vehicles running 24 hours a day, delivered 12,500 tons of supplies daily from Normandy ports to frontline units. Entire Liberty ships were dedicated to carrying nothing but tank parts. Mobile maintenance battalions followed advancing armor units carrying spare engines, transmissions, weapons, and the tools to install them. American tankers knew that if their Sherman took a non-catastrophic hit, it would be recovered, repaired, and returned to service. German tankers knew that a disabled Panzer was likely lost forever, either to Allied air power or to demolition charges their own engineers would plant before retreating. This created a psychological asymmetry that proved as important as any technical specification. American crews fought knowing their losses could be replaced. German crews fought knowing theirs could not. The crews who chose to fight here is where the story transcends statistics and enters the realm of something less quantifiable, but infinitely more powerful. The human element that no amount of armor plating could replicate. American tankers were not professional soldiers in the Prussian tradition. Most were civilians, barely a year removed from farms, factories, and college campuses. They were taught to operate their Shermans in training camps across the United States, where instructors emphasized mechanical reliability, crew coordination, and combined arms tactics. They knew their tanks were inferior to German heavy armor. They were not stupid. They read the after-action reports. They saw the burned-out hulks. They attended the memorials for crews who did not come back. And yet, when asked years later why they continued to climb into their Shermans day after day, mission after mission, knowing the odds, their answers revealed something the German war machine had not accounted for. They believed in what they were fighting for in a way that transcended self-preservation. Sergeant John McAuliffe, a Sherman gunner who fought from Normandy to the Elbe, put it this way in a 1989 interview. "We knew the Tiger could kill us easy. We knew the Panther was better armored and better armed. We knew all that. But we also knew we could get 5 Shermans for every one of their tanks, and we knew the Sherman would run all day without breaking down, and we knew that when we took a village, the French or Belgian or Dutch people came out and cried and thanked us because we were liberating them. The Germans, they were fighting for Hitler. We were fighting to go home. There's a difference in motivation that matters more than armor thickness. This sentiment appears again and again in letters, diaries, and oral histories. American tankers developed an almost affectionate relationship with their Shermans, nicknaming them, painting nose art on them, personalizing them despite knowing they might be incinerating tombs. The Sherman became a symbol not of American technological superiority, which it clearly was not, but of American resilience, adaptability, and industrial might. It represented the idea that democracy, despite being messy and inefficient, could mobilize resources and human will on a scale that totalitarian efficiency could not match. The Germans fought for Vaterland, for the Führer, for Lebensraum, and racial destiny. These are powerful motivators, but they are brittle. When the Ardennes offensive failed, when the Rhine was crossed, when Berlin was encircled, the ideological foundations crumbled. German panzer crews who had fought brilliantly for years found themselves questioning what they were dying for. By contrast, American tankers fought for something simpler and more durable, home. They fought to end the war so they could return to Iowa farms and Brooklyn neighborhoods and California orange groves. They fought because the alternative was allowing fascism to triumph. These motivations did not waver when the battles became difficult. If anything, they intensified. The symbolic can of Spam. In the turret of nearly every American Sherman tucked among the ammunition racks and radio equipment, crews kept small personal items, photographs, letters, Lucky Charms. But one item appeared with such regularity that it became an unofficial symbol of American armored warfare, the humble can of Spam, that pressed pork product that American GIs both mocked and relied upon. German panzer crews, surviving on dwindling rations of black bread and ersatz coffee, could not comprehend the abundance that American soldiers treated as mundane. When German forces overran American positions during the Battle of the Bulge, they discovered supply dumps containing not just military necessities, but luxuries that seemed obscene to soldiers whose homeland was starving. Chocolate bars, cigarettes by the carton, canned fruit, coffee, real coffee, and yes, cases upon cases of Spam. The Spam can, with its distinctive rectangular shape and key wind opener, became shorthand for everything the Sherman represented. It was mass-produced, utilitarian, not particularly glamorous, but unfailingly present. It was not gourmet cuisine, just as the Sherman was not a Tiger tank. But it was there, all was there, in quantities that seemed inexhaustible. You could hate it, mock it, complain about it, and soldiers did all three, but it kept you fed, kept you fighting, kept you moving forward. When Lieutenant Mackay's crew, in Lucky Legs, finally broke through German lines near Houffalize in late January 1945, after 3 weeks of the hardest fighting they had experienced, they halted in a liberated Belgian village. The tankers climbed out, filthy and exhausted, and found the villagers had almost no food. Without hesitation, the crew broke open their rations and distributed what they had, including, inevitably, cans of Spam. A Belgian woman, elderly and gaunt, accepted the can, examined it with confusion, then burst into tears. "You have so much," she said, in broken English, "that you can give it away. We thought such abundance was a dream." This moment, repeated in 1,000 villages across liberated Europe, captured the central truth that German military planners had missed. The Americans were not fighting from desperation or ideological fanaticism. They were fighting from abundance, and abundance is the most dangerous form of power because it cannot be destroyed by killing tanks. You can knock out a Sherman, but you cannot knock out the factory that made it and the 10 more waiting to replace it. The transformation of doctrine. By the winter of 1944-45, Something remarkable had occurred. American armored tactics had evolved from doctrine designed around the Sherman's limitations into doctrine that exploited those very characteristics as advantages. The Sherman's mobility, initially seen as a consolation prize for its lack of armor, became its primary weapon. American tank commanders learned to use terrain aggressively, advancing through covered approaches, using smoke to close range, and employing superior speed to flank German heavy tanks before they could bring their powerful guns to bear. The Sherman's reliability meant American armor could operate at tempos that German forces could not sustain, advancing rapidly, bypassing strong points, penetrating deep into enemy rear areas, while supply trucks kept pace and maintenance crews kept the machines running. The lightning war that Germany had invented was turned against them by an army whose tanks were individually inferior but systematically unstoppable. Training evolved to emphasize crew survival. Sherman crews were taught to bail out quickly when hit. The tank's wide hatches and relatively spacious interior actually made this easier than in the cramped German heavy tanks. They learned that staying alive to fight in another Sherman was more valuable than going down with the ship. German panzer training, rooted in aristocratic warrior traditions, emphasized fighting to the last. American training, rooted in pragmatic democracy, emphasized living to fight tomorrow. The result was that experienced American tank crews accumulated combat knowledge and became increasingly effective, while experienced German crews increasingly died in the burning panzers they refused to abandon. The introduction of the Sherman variant, armed with the 76mm high-velocity gun in mid-1944, and later the jumbo assault tank with increased armor, showed American willingness to adapt. But even these improved variants retained the Sherman's core philosophy: mechanical reliability, ease of production, and integration into a combined arms system. The Americans did not try to out-German the Germans by building super-heavy tanks. They improved the Sherman just enough while maintaining its essential advantages. Perhaps most critically, American forces perfected the art of combined arms warfare to a degree that rendered the tank versus tank engagement increasingly irrelevant. By 1945, German heavy tanks were being destroyed more often by aircraft, artillery, and tank destroyers than by other tanks. The Sherman's role had evolved from being the primary tank killer to being a mobile gun platform that supported infantry, exploited breakthroughs, and provided psychological pressure. The killing of panzers was increasingly left to specialized systems, while Shermans did what they did best: kept moving, kept pressure on the enemy, and kept the offensive rolling forward. The voices from the other side. Understanding why American tankers outfought Germany's best requires hearing from those who faced them. In the ruins of the Third Reich, captured German tank officers were interrogated by Allied intelligence. Their testimony reveals not contempt for American armor, but a grudging recognition of what had beaten them. General Major Hans von Luck, who commanded panzer units in France and later in the desperate defense of Germany itself, wrote in his post-war memoir, "We had better tanks. This is indisputable. But the Americans had a better system. When we destroyed 5 American tanks, they replaced them with 10. When we held a village, their artillery destroyed the village. When we retreated to the next position, their aircraft found us on the roads. When our tanks broke down, we had to abandon them. When their tanks broke down, they repaired them overnight. We were fighting tactical battles. They were fighting a war of systems. You cannot defeat a system by winning engagements. I learned this too late." Even more revealing were interviews with German tank crews who faced Shermans repeatedly and survived. Unteroffizier Gustav Schrodeck, a Panther gunner, explained, "In Russia, when we destroyed Soviet tanks, they often abandoned the battlefield. The survivors would not return. But the Americans, they were different. You could kill their tanks in the morning, and the same crews in new tanks would attack you again in the afternoon. They treated their Shermans like we treated ammunition. Expendable, replaceable. They never seemed discouraged. This was more frightening than any weapon they carried. How do you defeat an enemy who accepts losses as the cost of victory and has infinite resources to replace those losses? This was the psychological dimension that German armor could not overcome. The Wehrmacht was designed for short, decisive campaigns, smash the enemy's forces in a series of brilliant encirclements and maneuvers, force capitulation, then consolidate. But the Americans refused to be decisively defeated. They accepted tactical setbacks, absorbed horrific casualties, and kept grinding forward. The Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last great armored offensive, demonstrated this perfectly. German panzer spearheads achieved surprise, encircled American units, destroyed hundreds of vehicles, and created chaos in the Allied rear. And then, within weeks, the offensive collapsed, not because German armor was defeated in battle, but because it ran out of fuel, ammunition, and replacements, while American forces that had been shattered regrouped, resupplied, and counterattacked with fresh divisions that seemed to materialize from nowhere. The Sherman was the perfect vehicle for this kind of warfare, endlessly replaceable, mechanically reliable, and crewed by men who understood that individual heroism mattered less than collective persistence. The price paid none of this should diminish the very real horror that American tank crews experienced. The Sherman's tendency to burn when penetrated was not propaganda, it was deadly reality. The early models used gasoline engines and stored ammunition in configurations that made catastrophic fires, likely when hit. Crews developed macabre rituals. Some would urinate on rag scraps and keep them near the hatches, believing the wet cloth might protect their faces if they had to escape through flames. Others calculated which crew position had the best survival odds. Loader and driver had the best chance of escaping. The bowgunner, trapped in the hull, had the worst. The casualty statistics from armored units reflect the Sherman's vulnerabilities. The 3rd Armored Division, which fought from Normandy through Germany, suffered 54% casualties among its personnel, killed, wounded, or missing. Tank crews had a particularly grim rotation. Studies showed the average lifespan of a Sherman in heavy combat was measured in days, not weeks. Crews could expect to be brewed up, the British term for a tank catching fire, multiple times if they survived long enough. Corporal James Benton, who served in a Sherman crew through the entire European campaign, described the experience in his diary. Every morning we climb into the tank knowing we might burn alive by afternoon. We joke about it to keep from thinking about it too much. But at night, when I close my eyes, I see the faces of guys I knew, guys who were laughing and complaining about the food one day and were smoked the next. We don't hate the Sherman, it's just a machine. But we're not ignorant about what it is, a metal coffin that we pray gets us through one more day. This was the compact American tankers made. They would crew vulnerable machines, accept terrifying risks, and trust that the system would give them a chance to survive through numbers, support, and logistics. It was not a bargain anyone would make eagerly, but it was the bargain the war demanded. The final arithmetic. When historians tally the final counts, the arithmetic of the Sherman success becomes undeniable. The Third Reich's panzer forces, which had seemed unstoppable in 1940, were systematically annihilated between June 1944 and May 1945. American, British, and Canadian armored divisions equipped primarily with Shermans destroyed or captured thousands of German tanks, broke through the Siegfried Line, crossed the Rhine, and reduced German resistance to sporadic last stands. The Germans lost the armored war not because their tanks were inferior. They were superior in almost every technical specification. They lost because tanks do not fight in isolation. They exist within systems of production, supply, maintenance, training, doctrine, and national will. The German system, for all its technical brilliance and tactical expertise, was brittle. It required everything to work perfectly, production uninterrupted by strategic bombing, fuel supplies from conquered territories, skilled crews surviving long enough to pass on their expertise, and maintenance facilities close to the front lines. When those conditions disappeared, German armor became increasingly irrelevant, immobilized by lack of fuel, abandoned for lack of parts, destroyed by air power because they could not maneuver, and crewed by inexperienced teenagers who were sent into combat with weeks of training instead of years. The American system, built around the Sherman's modest capabilities and extraordinary reliability, proved anti-fragile. It got stronger as the war progressed. Production increased, tactics improved. Crews gained experience, supply chains became more efficient. Even the Sherman itself evolved, not into a super-heavy tank, but into increasingly effective variants that retained its core advantages while addressing its most glaring weaknesses. By war's end, American armored divisions were operating at tempos and distances that would have been impossible in 1942. Patton's Third Army famously advanced across France at speeds that outran their supply lines, made possible only because the Shermans kept running despite the abuse. The race to Berlin, the link-up with Soviet forces at the Elbe, the reduction of the Ruhr Pocket, all of these campaigns required armor that was dependable, numerous, and sustainable. The Sherman was all three. The poetic truth. On May 8, 1945, when the guns finally fell silent and Europe began counting its dead, Lieutenant Robert Mackay's crew sat on the hull of Lucky Legs somewhere in Czechoslovakia. The tank had carried them from Normandy to the war's end, a statistical improbability bordering on miracle. They had gone through 3 engines, 2 transmissions, 1 main gun, and countless track sections. The armor bore the scars of glancing hits, shell fragments, and small arms fire. The pinup girl painted on the glacis plate was faded and pockmarked. But the tank still ran. The crew was alive. They opened a can of Spam, there was always Spam, and shared it with liberated Czech civilians who gathered around the American tank like it was a shrine. The civilians touched the armor with reverence, asked questions in broken English, wanted to know where the Americans came from, what their homes were like, whether it was true that everyone in America had automobiles and refrigerators and more food than they could eat. Mackay tried to explain. He told them about Iowa and the endless cornfields. He told them about factories in Detroit that made cars, thousands and thousands of cars, and how those factories switched to making tanks with the same ruthless efficiency. He told them about a country so big you could drive for days and never reach the end of it, where people elected their leaders and argued about politics in newspapers that printed whatever they wanted without fear, where nobody cared what your grandfather's name was or what church you attended, because all that mattered was whether you did your job. The Czechs listened with expressions of wonder, as if he were describing a fairy tale kingdom, and perhaps he was. The Sherman sitting beside them, battered and unimpressive, next to the burned-out German Panthers that littered the roadside, represented something those Panthers never could: the industrial and ideological might of a democracy, fully mobilized for war. The German tanks had been beautiful in their way, elegant killing machines that represented the apex of engineering and the warrior tradition. But they had been built by a regime that measured its people's worth by race and loyalty, that destroyed rather than created, that conquered rather than liberated. Their armor was thick, but the system that produced them was hollow. When pressure was applied, it shattered. The Sherman was never beautiful. It was utilitarian, mass-produced, good enough. But it was built by a nation where a farm boy from Iowa and a factory worker from Detroit and a college student from California could each contribute to its production, where innovation came from 1,000 small improvements rather than central planning, where losses could be mourned but also replaced because the people producing the tanks believed in what the tanks were fighting for. In the end, that belief, that sense of purpose, rooted in something larger than tribal loyalty or racial superiority, proved more durable than the thickest armor. The American tanker who climbed into his Sherman each morning knowing it was outmatched, but trusting in his crew, his support, and his cause, represents a kind of courage that totalitarianism can never replicate. It is the courage not of fanatics willing to die for an ideology, but of citizens willing to risk death to end a war and return home. The Sherman's success was never about the tank, it was about the men who crewed it, the system that sustained it, and the civilization that built it, a civilization rooted in the messy, inefficient, endlessly generative principles of democracy and abundance. The Germans built better tanks, the Americans built a better world, one Sherman at a time, and drove it from the beaches of Normandy to the heart of the Reich. And when the surviving crews finally went home, they left behind thousands of their comrades who had burned in those thin-skinned coffins. They never pretended the Sherman was anything other than what it was, a death trap that somehow, improbably, carried democracy's armies to victory. They preferred it not because it was superior, but because it was theirs, and it was enough. Enough to win, enough to endure, enough to prove that in the arithmetic of war, numbers and will and belief can overcome steel and fire, enough to demonstrate that sometimes survival is its own form of superiority. The last cans of Spam were shared with strangers who became friends. The last engines coughed to life one more time for victory parades, and then the Shermans, like the men who crewed them, went home or were left behind, monuments to an improbable truth, that the underdog can win if he refuses to quit, and if he believes in something worth the terrible price of victory.